the book of Lamentations, chapter 1, verse 1 to 22. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become. She who was great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. She dwells now among the nations, but finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for none come to the festival. All her gates are desolate, her priests groan. Her virgins have been afflicted, and she herself suffers bitterly. Her foes have become the head, her enemies prosper, because the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away, captives before the foe. From the daughter of Zion, all her majesty has departed. Her princes have become like deer that find no pasture. They fled without strength before the pursuer. Jerusalem remembers in the days of her affliction and wandering all the precious things that were hers from days of old. When her people fell into the hand of the foe, and there was none to help her, her foes gloated over her. They mocked at her downfall. Jerusalem sinned grievously, therefore she became filthy. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Therefore her fall is terrible. She has no comforter. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. The enemy has stretched out his hands over all her precious things. For she has seen the nations enter her sanctuary, those whom you forbade to enter your congregation. All her people groan as they search for bread. They trade their treasures for food to revive their strength. Look, O Lord, and see, for I am despised. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. From on high he sent fire into my bones, he made it descend. He spread a net for my feet, he turned me back. He has left me stunned, faint, all the day long. My transgressions were bound into a yoke. By his hand they were fastened together. They were set upon my neck. He caused my strength to fail. The Lord gave me into the hands of those whom I cannot withstand. The Lord rejected all my mighty men in my midst. He summoned an assembly against me to crush my young men. The Lord has trodden as in a winepress the virgin daughter of Judah. For these things I weep. My eyes flow with tears. For a comforter is far from me, one to revive my spirit. My children are desolate, for the enemy has prevailed. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is none to comfort her. The Lord has commanded against Jacob that his neighbors should be his foes. Jerusalem has become a filthy thing among them. The Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. But hear, all you peoples, and see my suffering. My young women and my young men have gone into captivity. I called to my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and elders perished in the city, while they sought food to revive their strength. Look, O Lord, for I am in distress. My stomach churns. My heart is wrung within me, because I have been very rebellious. In the street, the sword bereaves. In the house, it is like death. They heard my groaning, yet there is no one to comfort me. All my enemies have heard of my trouble. They are glad that you have done it. You have brought the day you announced. Now let them be as I am. Let all their evil doing come before you, and deal with them as you have dealt with me because of all my transgressions. For my groans are many, and my heart is faint. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, good evening, Hopies Village. My name is Drew. For those of you who are here for the first time, I have the privilege of serving as one of the pastors here at Hope, and I'm really excited that you chose to worship with us tonight, and I'm excited for the ways that God wants to meet us tonight. We just came through a 4-week series on the book of Philippians, finished that up last week, and so this week we are starting a brand new series, 5-week series, called The Thrill Is Gone, Learning the Language of Lament, in which we're going to spend time in what to many of us is an obscure book of the Bible called the book of Lamentations. Now, I think it's safe to say that most of us haven't really spent time in Lamentations. It's not a book of the Bible that we typically open up to when we need a pick-me-up or an encouragement before we get our day started. It's usually not the book that your Bible app is going to choose from to send you your verse for the day. No, Lamentations is a book of sorrows. It's a collection of poems that emerges out of a place of grief, confusion, disorientation, and anger. Lamentations is the blues song of the Bible. It's why we named our series The Thrill Is Gone, which is one of the most popular blues songs of all time, written by Roy Hawkins and popularized by B.B. King and his guitar Lucille. And the song is basically about expressing the emotions of a relationship gone bad. Something happened that stole the thrill and the joy away from that relationship. And from the perspective of the artist, the relationship is dead and it ain't coming back. The thrill is gone. So to help bring us into the experience of the blues, I've asked some friends to come and lead us for a moment tonight. So fellas, come on up. I've asked Matt and John to help us enter into the experience and understand what blues and what lament is all about.
Like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long, long way from home. Yeah.
You know, Bruce Springsteen said that some of the greatest blues music is some of the darkest music you've ever heard. And he's right. The blues is dark music. Lamentations is dark music, but it's honest music. And so if you're wondering to yourself, why 5 weeks in Lamentations? This is it. It's because we not only need to learn how to be honest about our pain, our grief, our anger, and our sorrow, but we need to learn that it's okay for us to be honest about these things. And not only is it okay for us, but it's necessary for us to be honest about these things. Because we live in a culture of denial. Broadly speaking, the American culture that we live in doesn't do lament. The pattern of our culture is to move quickly past pain, grief, and sorrow in order to get back to the pursuit of happiness. It's like lament just gets in the way of us doing what we need to do. And there's really no space for it. That's why sometimes when you see someone who just becomes overwhelmed with grief and sorrow and tears in your presence, they find themselves having to apologize. They end up apologizing to you for their grief. You ever been in an experience like that? Where someone just starts crying. There's something deep within them, and it just comes out, and they start apologizing to you for crying. See, because our culture has taught us that grief is an inconvenience and a nuisance. Not only that, but we have all grown up in family cultures in which, in different ways, they have all shaped how we engage with and handle our pain. And I don't know about you, but the emotions of pain, anger, and sorrow were things that I was just never taught how to deal with. I became a person who just learned how to bury those things, stuff them somewhere deep inside. And so for most of my life, I've been an emotional infant in this area. But the book of Lamentations opens us up to an entirely different world of engagement with these sorts of feelings, emotions, and realities. And as we jump into this series, I know that there are going to be some things that come to the surface for you. Painful things that rise up to the surface. And I just want to invite you to not push those things back down when they come up. Now, the purpose of this series isn't to offer you a resolution to those things. Resolution isn't the point of lament. But this series is meant to offer you the space to name those things and to be honest about those things. Kathleen O'Connor, who wrote an absolutely wonderful commentary on the book of Lamentations, says this. She says, Lamentations names what is wrong, what is out of order in God's world, what keeps human beings from thriving in all their creative potential. Simple acts of lament expose these conditions, name them, open them to grief and anger, and make them visible for remedy. We can't even begin to walk down the path toward healing, individually speaking and socially speaking, if we aren't given the space to name what is out of joint. And so if there's one thing I'm hoping emerges out of this series, is that as a community, we can take a step in the direction of creating a culture where we can deal honestly with our pain and with the pain of our world. Let's pray. God, we look to you. We acknowledge that you are the kind of God that likes to meet us in the depths of our sorrow. You meet us in our pain. You walk with us through the dark valleys. You are the God who is with us, Emmanuel. Not just with us in our joys, not just with us when we feel blessed, not just with us when we feel good and excited, but with us in the valley. With us when we feel low. With us when we don't even feel like you're with us. We thank you that that's who you are. And so tonight we look to you. And Lord, as those things come up, as we name and identify the places of pain and anger and grief that lie within us, Lord, I pray that you would give us the courage to not push those things back down, but to name them honestly and to hold them before you. Meet us tonight, God. Minister to us tonight, God. We need you. I need you. So, Lord, I ask that you would let the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, oh God. Let the words of my mouth be acceptable in your sight, oh God. Our strength and our Redeemer, in whom we trust. It's in Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. So the title of our sermon tonight is simply this: look at my pain. Look at my pain. The year was 586 BC. Something took place in the land of Israel, in the city of Jerusalem, that would mark the Jewish people forever. Babylon had laid siege to the city. Jerusalem, the holy city, Zion, the city of God, was destroyed. And Babylon, through violence, had forced the inhabitants of Jerusalem to surrender. The young men of Jerusalem were taken captive and brought as slaves to Babylon. The women of Jerusalem were exposed and raped. The widows and young children were left behind without anyone to care for them. The city lay in ruins. This is the setting of the book of Lamentations. It's out of the rubble and the ash heap of a destroyed Jerusalem that these 5 poems arise to give voice to the anguish of a people trying to make sense of it all. Understand that Lamentations is not a theological treatise on suffering. It was not written to answer the question, if there is a good God, why is there suffering? But it was written to express the anguish of a suffering people. The voices present in Lamentations are the voices of those who have been left behind in the destroyed city. So these aren't the best and the brightest of Jerusalem. These aren't the upwardly mobile ones. No, Babylon had taken them away. These are the quote-unquote throwaways of society. The ones that Babylon had no use for. The ones that weren't even good enough to be slaves. These are the marginalized of the marginalized. The oppressed of the oppressed. And if Lamentations is telling us anything, it's telling us to not drown out the voices of the oppressed ones in our midst, because we need them for our spiritual and our social transformation. See, Lamentations is the voice of Eric Garner crying out, I can't breathe. Lamentations is the cry of a mother and her young child dying of dehydration in the Mexican desert because they've been turned back at the border. And Lamentations is the voice of anguish within each one of us that goes unseen, unheard, and unacknowledged. As we go through Lamentations, you'll see that there are 3 main characters that speak throughout the book, 2 of which we meet here in the first chapter. The narrator who most scholars believe is the prophet Jeremiah, and the voice of a woman named Daughter Zion, who is the personification of the city of Jerusalem. But it's important for me to say up front that there is one voice that is noticeably absent from the book of Lamentations, and that's the voice of God. God does not speak at all in this book. The suffering that daughter Zion has experienced is unimaginable. But what takes it to a whole other level, what makes her suffering unbearable, is that to her, God is absent from it all. God is nowhere to be found. The resounding cry throughout Lamentations is, "Where are you, God? Do you even care? Where are you, God? Do you even care? Do you care about my hurt? Do you care about my pain? Do you care about my loss? Do you care about my grief?" The one line that is repeated over and over again in the first poem, in the first chapter, is the line, "There is no one to comfort her." Over and over again, there is no one to comfort her. Daughter Zion, in her suffering, has nowhere to turn for comfort. The one thing that we all need when we are in pain and when we are grieving is someone alongside of us who, even if they don't fully get it, they are just with us in this thing. But daughter Zion has no one. And her voicing that reality is meant to be an indictment against God. You who promised to be my comfort. You who promised to be my salvation. You who promised to be my rescue, you're nowhere to be found. And for some of you, that cry, "Where are you, God? Do you even care?" that is a cry that is native to your own soul. Like you get that on a deep level. That question is no stranger to your lips. And what the book of Lamentations, what the existence of this book is communicating to us is that we are invited to express and to feel all of these things. Some of us have been told that there is no room for these sorts of feelings and these sorts of questions in the life of faith. But let me tell you something. 40% of the Psalms that we have in our Bible are known as Psalms of Lament. Psalms that are wrestling with these very feelings and asking these very questions. There's an entire book of the Bible committed, dedicated to lament. And even at the central moment of our faith, the crucifixion of Jesus, the one that we call Savior, cries out a lamentation from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?" So if you find yourself wrestling with these feelings and questions, understand that you are in good company. And I believe that even the voicelessness of God in this book, in the voicelessness, God is communicating a strong, strong message. That the voice of the sufferer must be heard in her fullness. And that not even God will interrupt that. See, in a world that has a way of silencing suffering voices, when this has been the norm in our communities, in our families, in our churches, knowing that God does not silence or interrupt suffering voices, but gives space for suffering voices to be heard is actually good news to my soul. That God is not a God who silences the voices of the suffering. That God is not a God who even interrupts the cries of the suffering, but says, you need to express those things. You need space to let that out. without anyone trying to tell you or interpret for you what your suffering is. So I want you to come with me. And I want you to picture this scene. Imagine you are sitting and you're watching a play. And the entire stage is dark. But in the middle of the stage, a spotlight gets shown on a woman bent over with her head in her hands, and you can tell that she's in anguish. As she kneels in the middle of the stage, someone just begins to walk around her and comment on her situation. So if daughter Zion is right here, it's like someone is just sort of walking around her, looking at her, and trying to comment on her pain. This narrator that we get introduced to right off the bat is the one that's walking around and commenting. The narrator is the first one to speak, and from his perspective, as he walks around daughter Zion, this is what he says. This is what he begins to say. He's looking at her and he says, "How lonely sits the city that was once full of people. How like a widow she has become, she who was great among the nations, she who was a princess among the provinces, has become a slave." But what the narrator is saying here is actually much more jarring than it first appears. The Hebrew word that is translated here as how is the word ekah. And it's meant to be heard as a loud, screeching cry of anguish. So if you've ever been to a funeral, or if you've seen footage of a funeral where someone approaches the casket and they just can't contain themselves and they cry out in anguish, that's what's going on here. It's like the narrator is looking at a dead body and crying out, "How can this be? How could this have happened? How is it that she's dead?" A woman by the name of Ann Hood, in her book Comfort, A Journey Through Grief, says that the Hebrew word ekah, is not the kind of scream that comes from fright, but the kind that comes from the deepest grief imaginable. It is a scream that comes when there are no words to express what you feel. It is a scream that rails against logic and fate and everything there is. The picture that comes to mind for me as I read this is the picture of Mamie Till, the mother of Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old black boy that was beaten and brutalized and lynched in Mississippi by two white men for allegedly whistling at a white woman. And this picture that you see here on the screen, this is the moment that Mamie Till's son, Emmett, was delivered back to her in Chicago in a pine box. She could not contain herself. Mamie Till said, Have you ever sent a loved one on a vacation and had him return to you in a pine box, so horribly battered and waterlogged that someone needs to tell you that this sickening sight is your son lynched? Ekah, how can this be? This is Lamentations. Lamentations is written in a genre known as a funeral dirge. Korean American theologian Soong-Chan Rah points out in his book, Prophetic Lament, that the funeral dirge is the song that was sung when there's a dead body in the room. It's a recognition of and a dealing with the loss. And there's no expectation of reversing the loss. There's no hope of bringing the dead body back. We've all dealt with death. For some of us, this was the physical death of a loved one. Like for me, when my mom passed away 6 years ago after a battle with cancer. Others of us have walked through different kinds of death. The death of a relationship that was once strong, maybe with parents or friend, spouse. The death of a certain season of life that isn't coming back. It's gone. The death of a dream that we always had. Whatever it is, something is gone. And most of us haven't been given the space, haven't been given the permission, and haven't been taught how to grieve those losses. So what ends up happening is we walk around holding grief and sadness and anger in our bodies. And it manifests itself in our day-to-day lives, but we often don't recognize it. Pete Scazzaro says in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, that when we do not process before God the very feelings that make us human, such as fear, sadness, or anger, we leak. Meaning that the unprocessed and unacknowledged emotions that we've stuffed inside have to come out somehow. And they end up leaking all over the people around us. And this happens for us in different ways. For some of us, it's blowing up in angry fits of rage just because the train is late. For some of us, it shows up in an irritability that we just walk around with and we don't know why. Something is off, but we just don't know what it is. For some of us, it just causes us to be distracted, unable to really be present to the people in front of us or the task at hand that we have to accomplish. It can show up in a variety of ways. But the point is that unacknowledged and unprocessed sadness and anger is dangerous for us and for others around us. And Lamentations is saying to us loudly that we must deal with the dead body in the room. We've got to acknowledge its reality and we've got to process the pain. Just this past week, I was walking down the East River. After going for a run and working out, I was walking back home, and I found myself in a place of prayer, just praying. And as I was praying, I started to ask myself those questions that Chelsea posed for us last week in the sermon on anxiety. Those 4 questions to ask ourselves. What am I anxious about? What am I mad about? What am I glad about, and what am I sad about? And when I got to that question about sadness, all of these feelings began to rush to the surface about my mom's death 6 years ago. And it's not like I haven't processed my mom's passing. But in that moment, I realized just how deeply I carry this grief in my body. And what I started to process through more and more was that I'm not just grieving the loss of my mom, but I'm grieving everything that it feels like died with her. Like the fact that there are just certain family dynamics that are not there anymore. My mom was like the glue that pulled all of us together. And now that she's gone, I don't see my brothers and I don't see my dad nearly as much. I'm grieving that. That just, it is. I'm grieving that. I'm grieving the reality that the family dynamic that my daughters get to experience is not the one that I grew up with all my brothers coming together and my dad and my mom and us hanging out and enjoying one another. Like they don't experience that. I'm grieving that. And all that stuff came up for me as I just asked myself that question, what am I sad about? And I felt like it was an invitation for me. God was giving me an invitation to continue just to hold that before him, to continue processing that more deeply, to invite others into that space with me so it doesn't just sit inside tucked away from everybody else, but I can hold it out here. Acknowledge it and name it, and not just quickly move past. I wasn't even going to share this, but I was on the train this week, Wednesday. And I was headed to Queens. And as we're on our way, I'm on the R train, all of a sudden the train stops. The conductor comes over the speaker and says that the emergency brake has been triggered. They tell us that there's someone on the tracks. So we're all sitting there. It was fascinating just to see how people are processing this reality. First, they told us there's someone on the tracks. Then they come and they tell us that our train hit a person. And I'm in the second train car. So not only has the train hit somebody, but that person is literally under the train that I'm sitting on, under that car. One of the MTA workers comes into the train and she's explaining to us the situation, explaining to us that there's a person underneath, and everybody's just, trying to process, trying to figure this out, doesn't know what to do. Some people are just angry. Like not angry at the fact that like there's somebody under the train, but angry at the fact that our train is being held up. We just need to go. I got places to be. Someone literally said, "Who cares about him? We've got to go." And I'm just sitting there and I'm like, we don't even know what to do with this moment. Like we don't know how to process this moment. So we get off the train, like the first train car has pulled into 34th Street Station, so we have to walk all the way up to the first train and then get out. There's a bunch of rescue workers there. They're literally trying to get this man out as we're walking off the train. And it was just this surreal moment. You got people who are just sort of dazed trying to process this. You got people who are just angry and like, I'm just mad that I'm late to the thing that I've got to go to. You got people that are pulling out their phones and trying to. And I just feel like we just need a moment to like process this. But it was just, we walk off the train and everybody goes on to the next thing. Like that was a picture of why we need Lamentations. Because even in that moment, like that was a traumatic moment. That's trauma right there. And when we don't process that, what do we do with it? We just take it, we stuff it, and we move on. But you realize that comes out. It comes out. There's got to be even just a space where we can name it, cry over it, shout about it. Yeah, we need that space. So as we turn back to Lamentations 1 with a spotlight on the narrator and a spotlight on daughter Zion, the narrator keeps describing the situation of daughter Zion's sorrow for 8 verses. But in verse 9, daughter Zion speaks for the first time. And it's very abrupt, almost as if she's cutting off the narrator's commentary about her to say, "Excuse me, sir, I can speak for myself." So while the narrator is speaking as an outside observer of her pain, she speaks from within her own pain. But the first words that she says are interesting. Her words are directed to God, but she doesn't ask God to rectify her situation. She doesn't ask God to bring back her exiled sons. She doesn't ask God to rebuild the walls of the city. She doesn't ask God to destroy her enemies. She says this: "Look at me in my pain, O God. Look at me." Kathleen O'Connor says she does not beg for relief, for vindication, or for restoration. She does not ask for the return of her children, for freedom, or for the return of past splendor. She asks only that God will look, see, take into consciousness what the enemy has done to her. She wants God to see her pain. She demands the same thing again in verse 11. But when God does not answer, she looks at everyone else who is passing by her as she's sitting there in her sorrow, some of them mocking her in her pain. And she says, "Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and pay attention." I don't know that there's any deeper heartache than to be in pain and yet not feel seen. Psychologist Virginia Satter, she said, "I believe the greatest gift I can conceive of having from anyone is to be seen by them." And isn't that true? How many of us just want to be seen? How many of us just want to acknowledge that our pain is real? Because when our pain is seen, when our pain is acknowledged, it communicates to us that our pain matters. It communicates to us that our lives matter. I mean, that was what was at the core of an entire community crying out, "Black Lives Matter." It was a cry of lamentation. It was a cry to say, "Look at me in my pain. See it. Don't turn away from it. All you who pass by, do you even care? Look, see, acknowledge, take it into your consciousness." But you know, daughter Zion and her demand to be seen by God is actually demonstrating a beautiful act of faith. Because what she's doing is she's calling God to the carpet. You know, one of the names of God in the Bible is the name El Roi, the God who sees. His name first shows up in Genesis chapter 16 from the lips of Hagar, the castaway servant girl of Abraham and Sarah. When Sarah couldn't conceive, she and Abraham came up with a plan for Abraham to sleep with Hagar so that she could bear for them a child and carry on the legacy, carry on the name, be the fulfillment of a promise. But after Hagar conceived, Sarah started to get jealous. And so Abraham and Sarah threw Hagar out of the house into the desert to be forgotten. But in the desert, God came to Hagar and blessed Hagar. And at that moment of blessing, Hagar said, "You are El Roy, the God who sees me." When nobody else wants to see me in my pain, you are the God who sees me. Even out here in the desert where I've been left to be forgotten, exiled out into the desert, you are the God who sees me. Here in Lamentations, daughter Zion is saying to God, you made covenant with me, God. You called me your prized possession, the apple of your eye. All I want is for you to be who you said you would be. Do for me what you did for Hagar when she was cast away, exiled into the desert, and see me. Just see me. My whole intention with this sermon was really just to bring us as a community into this prayer. Look at my pain, oh God. Pay attention to my affliction and just see me. Because the reality is that many of us in here do not feel seen. We do not feel like our pain matters to anyone else or to God, if we're honest. If we can take a moment and just be real and just be honest with our own selves. And so what I'm praying for today is not that you would have your pain resolved tonight. Not that you would be given an answer that allows you to tie a neat ribbon around that thing and walk away. But that tonight you would take a step and acknowledge your pain, name your pain by holding it before God and saying, look, pay attention, and see me. Worship team, why don't you come on up? As the worship team comes up, we are going to do something a bit different tonight. To respond. Some of you may have noticed that on the end of your rows, there are some index cards there and some pens in the rows. What I want to invite you to do is as the worship team leads us into this space of reflection, I want you to just, you don't have to necessarily come into this point of singing, but just take this time, take that card. You don't have to write your name on it. You don't have to do anything with it. But take the card, take the pen, and whatever it is that's coming up for you, or whatever it is that you would identify, maybe it's more than one thing, but whatever it is that you would identify tonight as your pain, your grief, your sorrow, write it down. Name it. Write it on that card. If you want to write your name on it, because maybe you would like someone to connect with you or follow up with you and pray with you and talk with you, and you can do that. You can write your name, write your email in there, and someone from the pastoral team would love to come and walk with you. But what I'm going to invite you to do tonight is, as the worship team plays, there's going to be a basket right up here on the front, right here. And as you feel led, as you feel comfortable, take that card which represents your pain. Fold it in half and just come up and just place it in this basket. As a way for you to hold it before God and say, look at this, God. And what we're going to do just as a community is, as we gather all of our grief in this basket, we are just going to simply hold our grief up before God and say, God, behold our affliction. See us. We need you to see us. We need you to acknowledge our hurt. We need you to acknowledge our pain. We need to know that you are the God who sees. That's just going to be our communal cry together tonight as we enter into the space of lamentation. There are going to be some people up here who are available to pray for you. And if you would desire to actually receive prayer from somebody tonight, please just come and they would love to pray for you.